Dr. McKenna, what's top of mind for you this morning?
Well, Sabbath, I had a conversation this morning with a good friend of ours, good friend of Wild Leaders, named Bill Anderson, that you know. And Bill has been the global chair of this very significant and large nonprofit, global nonprofit, and he sits in the middle of Scotland. So he had me at Scotland, but listen to his accent, and it's the most amazing thing ever. And it is so humbling every time I speak to Bill. Um, and even when I went into the conversation, I was trying to understand, like, how can I support Bill, this friend of ours, this senior leader? He's 82 years old. And one of the things he said to me, this was probably a year or two ago, Sabbath, he said, no one had ever invited me to dream. And he said, you invited me to dream. And I'm blown away by that because I know the scope and scale of his role, and he's 82 years old. And for him to say that is so incredibly humbling. But this morning, it was powerful because he said some things that I just were so surprising to me. And he said one of the reasons that being a part of the Wild Leaders community has been powerful for him is he said that we looked beyond his faults and we saw his needs. And he said so many people in his life had never looked beyond his need, or what they did is they looked beyond his needs to his faults. And it was such a powerful statement. And then I asked him, I said, Bill, your experience of whole leader development and our investment in you, and just our community's investment in you, how do you relate that to trust? I was so curious about what he would say. And what he said was this. He said, for me, trust was a way to get beyond or get rid of, he said, my anger, my bitterness, and some of my resentment. And he said, I made progress from hurting to healing to trust. And then he said this. He said, if we only go to healing, there is no future.
Yeah.
And I was blown away by that statement that trust for him represents a future.
Yeah. A hope and what's possible, that dream that being a part of the wild community opened up for him. That's huge.
Yeah, which causes me to be very excited for our conversation today, just to set the frame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So who is with us today?
Hey,
Yeah.
Rob. Hi there.
Let's get this wild conversation going. Welcome to the wild conversation where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to have a wild conversation with Nate Regier. He's the co founder and chief executive officer of Next Element, dedicated to helping build thriving workplace cultures. He's a psychologist and an internationally recognized voice on topics of social emotional intelligence, interpersonal communication, positive conflict, and leadership. Nate is also the author of 4 books, including Compassionate Accountability, How Leaders Build Connection and Get Results, and Seeing People Through. He hosts the Compassionate Accountability podcast. And most importantly, Nate is a longtime friend of Wild Leaders. Nate, thank you for being with us today.
Sabbath, thank you so much for that invitation. It's great to be here. Dr. McKenna, may I call you Rob?
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you. What a joy to be here. And I appreciated that reflection. I'm already got a bunch of gears turning in my head after what you just shared.
I bet
Yeah.
you.
All right. We're going to play a quick round of wild cards. Nate, we didn't prep you for this. I don't know if you've played wild cards, but we have a deck of cards, about 50 of
Okay.
them. Each has a developmental focused question on it. So I just
Okay.
pulled 10 and I haven't picked them. I just pulled 10 from the deck.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go around and we'll each have a chance to answer one. So we'll pick a
Okay.
number between 1 and 10. I'll go first. You can go next, Nate, and then Rob, you'll round us out. So I'm going to choose number 4. I'll go this way. All right. And it is, what would change if you were applying the lessons from your past experiences? That is a wonderful question, and it makes me think of Bill Anderson's reflections this morning and moving from healing to trust. And I would say, if I were learning from my past experiences, I would learn to see people for who they are, not for who I'm judging them to be. I'm really working on that.
Mm,
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
all right, Nate.
3. I like threes
All
and
right.
things that come in threes.
Okay. Number 3. Are you more focused on urgency or patience today?
Oh, that is so pertinent because the last 2 weeks have been increasing focus on urgency at the expense of sanity. So my wife and I made some critical decisions about some things going on in the background of our lives on Friday to choose patience over urgency and regain control over our own mental health. And it's been really the one, 2 or 3 of the most beautiful days, realizing that the clock is not in charge of us; it's the other way around. So patience.
Yeah. Powerful. Thank you. Rob?
I got to go with number 9.
All
Let's
right.
go with number 9.
Okay. What is the bigger purpose behind every meeting on your schedule today?
To be present. To be present. And I think as Nate would say, to be present in the process, like to think about how I'm showing up and not just what I'm actually saying. So something that's important for all of us. But I think that's my purpose today. Be present. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabbath. There's those cards, Nate, are I had a hand in authoring them, and so they always surprise me, and I think I can answer those questions every single day. So I am so grateful. I thinking about when we met, I think we met first time at a conference years ago, and love your work and have so much respect for what you do, and just to have you in our corner and to be in yours is a powerful thing. It really is. And so I wondered, Nate, if you would start off by, I don't know, to get a little personal, is I'd love to hear a little bit about how and why you became a psychologist. And even some of the formative experiences before, because you and I, there's, oh my goodness, there's places we're gonna go that are fun regarding all the things we'd like to talk about. But
Yeah.
maybe one or two of the formative experiences
Mhm.
that shaped who you are, and your passion for working with organizations and leaders. I would love
Yeah.
to hear a little bit about that, and for our listeners to hear that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I am a recovering psychologist, and I say that in the best possible way. What I mean by recovering is that every day I'm learning about the half-life of knowledge and how we have to just keep learning every single day. And so it's re-upping that curiosity and that interest every day. Um, I'll tell you 2 quick little stories that were probably very formative in who I am today. First one was when I was 7 years old in a little village in Zaire, Africa, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. My parents were missionaries there. My dad is a farmer from Kansas. My mom was a nurse,
Hmm.
and they were doing agriculture development. And um, almost every night, I would fall asleep on my mom's lap, sitting around a fire in a circle of wicker chairs in our backyard with elders of the community, neighbors, members. We would have probably shared a meal and we would just be talking, and the fire would be crackling, and I would fall asleep on her lap. And I can still remember the feeling of her heart, her abdomen. When she would talk, her abdomen would tighten, and I could feel that. And I
Huh.
knew that I was still connected to her. But I would wake up every morning in my bed because I'd fall asleep. They'd put me to bed. Except one night, I woke up in the middle of the night because the window to my bedroom faced the backyard and it was ablaze with bright light. And when I was startled, I got up and looked out the window, and what I saw was an inferno, a huge fire where we had been sitting. And around that fire were two shapes moving. And I realized finally that one of them was my dad, and the other one was another person, which I quickly identified was the um in those days they called it the town demon possessed maniac, probably had schizophrenia. Um, and I watched as my dad managed that situation. I realized that this guy was throwing our wicker chairs in the fire.
Mm.
Probably command hallucinations, I came to learn as a psychologist. My dad, while I watched, navigated that situation to the point where the only last two chairs they were sitting in and having a conversation. As
Hmm.
he de-escalated that and connected with this person who was destroying our property. And I thought, wow, I went from feeling so scared to just admiring my dad.
Wow.
And I wanted to be like that. Um, and I think that metaphor of walking into the fire, but also not getting hurt it was important for me.
Hmm.
Fast forward to college, my second year, I was a psychology major. I wanted to go into psychology. I wanted to help people, but I was also a bit of an entrepreneur. And so I was taking lots of economics courses, but I was struggling in economics. I just didn't get it. And I barely got an A in economics one. Then economics two, I got an A minus. And then economics three, I went to pick up my textbook, and this was in the early 80s. And the textbook was like this thick, and it was
Yeah.
shrink wrapped with what they used to call a floppy disk. Remember those?
Yeah.
And word on the street was floppy disks could hold as much information as like 20 of those books.
Hmm.
And so I looked at that and I saw a stack of 21 books, and I said, can't do this. I quit. I went to my advisor and said, I just want to do psychology.
Hmm.
Surely that would be easier. So I actually got into psychology because I lost my own confidence in economics.
Hmm.
And that was the beginning. That was a very formative period because I really shifted all my focus and just completely fell in love with psychology. And this idea of still being an entrepreneur, but my whole goal was to sell other human beings. But the product I was selling was their belief in themselves as whole human beings, what they could do, what they could accomplish. So I was selling people on their own capability and value and responsibility from the beginning. Um, so those are two
Hmm.
formative bits in my
Yeah.
life.
Does so one of the things that you mentioned, and I relate to this, is that emphasis on psychology. So I started there as well. Like I
Mhm.
wanted to really dive into the best work in the world, the best research I could to understand. It was more than just the way people think and perform, but it was like I was just fascinated by human beings in relationship to work because they spend so much time there.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about the lens through which you see the world. I think that we all kind of have our own sort of perspective on those things. And you described yourself just a minute ago as a recovering psychologist. And you may have been saying that flippantly, but I'm kind of wondering if there, because I feel some of that too. I could
Yeah.
explain my own story around that. So, what do you mean by that? And how do you see the world through that lens of a psychological lens? You map in that experience from your childhood, and I'm sure other kinds of formative
Mhm.
moments as well. Um,
Yeah.
how do you see the world today?
Yeah, I might maybe should call myself a repurposed psychologist
Huh.
because
Okay.
I started my career doing clinical psychology, therapy, neuropsychological assessment, addictions treatment. So I'm in the thick of trying to help people deal with either really bad habits, addictions, or situations that they really finding themselves in really difficult, challenging situations and trying to change the dynamics in their lives. And so my lens is through behavioral psychology, the science of behavior, why people do what they do. How does behavior actually change and how do you sustain behavior change? But then also, my clinical psychology program is very heavily the heavy emphasis was on the research academic side. So measuring behavior, studying change, being able to quantify the things that so many people think are soft. And I just had the good fortune of being involved with a behavioral or a org consulting division in where I was a psychologist. It was a multi-specialty behavioral health thing. And I ended up taking over their EAP program, employee
Uh,
assistance programs. And so I
yeah.
started seeing all of the mental health issues in the workplace and how these relationships and these dynamics and these habits were rampant in the workplace. I saw 1% of them in my therapy office. And
Mm,
at that moment, I realized, okay, I need to repurpose all of this skill in a corporate setting because that's where they need it the most. And when organizations are healthy and leaders are healthy, it impacts hundreds of lives. When I do therapy, I might impact one or two lives.
yeah. That's so interesting, Nate. I relate to so many pieces of that because I think this is why you and I just immediately sort of had a resonance with between us because we had this developing under a psychological sort of framework, and then all of a sudden seeing connections out to organizational things was very interesting. And I would say, it's funny, one of the biggest transitions for me more recently, I mean, in the last few years, even, because I was so formed under the whole on the job development movement and research for that started in the 80s and kept pushing forward about how people learn on the job as they're going through crucible, trial by fire, talking about walking into the fire kinds of experiences that you
Yeah.
describe more literally. And it's like, and so I was struck by that any leader development activity or personal development activity needs to connect to what people are actually doing.
Yes.
And but it took me a lot later to realize was that connection between learning and development of a person and a whole person that you and I both would describe and an organization is occurring all the way up through the scale of that. So that the most powerful developmental processes are connected to the mission of what an organization is trying to do. And so it was a really powerful sort of escalation of that from the individual learning on the job to this connection between development systemically and what's happening in organizations. Um, and connecting those dots is interesting because people don't realize if you grow up through the psychological literature and research and so on, you get really focused in that space, right? And you have this connection out to organizational things while an incredible heart for the person. Is that an
Well,
accurate description of you?
well, it is. And that's also my upbringing as a son of missionary parents. So this heart, this value, this essential, the whole idea about human beings are worthy and essentially whole. But connecting back to the first time we met, I sensed that same framework with you because you were sharing really practical, actionable organizational and leader development concepts and principles. But I knew there was solid research behind it. And yet
Hmm.
you weren't overcomplicating it. And I think that's a mission that a few people like you and I choose to take on, which is we have to connect the academic literature with the real world. And there's a huge gap there. And I see it all over the place. And I'm about practical application. So I think that might be another thing we have in common is it has to be real, practical, impactful, and yet evidence-based and rooted in the research.
That is so true. And so much of the story in my own development to try to, and I mean this in a way that's like necessary, is to make the research that's out there approachable for people to actually apply it, right? And there's such a division there so often. I guess I really want to know so that our listeners could hear this as well is what are you working on lately that is has been really powerful and motivating for you? Well, what are you thinking about? What are you studying? What are your investments in leaders? And
Mhm.
what is it that has got you lit up right now?
Very much lit up, so much that I was working on it this morning before we got on this. So compassionate accountability is our overarching framework and organizing, it's our organizing system for all of why we exist at Next Element. This notion that compassion and accountability or relationships and results or people and process, those don't have to be at odds. And in fact, it's an artificial and unfortunate distinction that we make. So, but within that, right now, I am lit up by exploring the intersection of conflict and trust. And this is something that the more I look into this, the more fascinating it gets. And I can go any angle you want with that, but right now I am very lit up by this connection. I think there is some incredible discoveries to be made and some powerful stuff going on there when we start to look at how those two things relate to one another and potentially actually feed off each other to create thriving work cultures and whole people.
So, okay. So you're opening up a really awesome bag of tricks right now. So you know that it excites me to talk with you about this because we understand each other and we see the importance of this. So one of the things that emerged in our, I've told you that we're publishing our State of Trust report coming up very soon, and one of the key drivers of a team level of trust. And so we assess what's called the Wild Trust Index. We assess trust at 3 levels. For those that aren't familiar with it, the personal level, so this foundational level, we always say like that's where trust begins within the person. Like if we begin to develop a sense of awareness across some really fundamental areas of psychological, psychological principles applied to my life, then I start to build the necessary foundation for trust. But that trust is a relational concept, so it's not till we get to the team level, where it's something we describe personal trust as awareness within. That team level trust is these patterns between us, and that organizational level trust is our top circle of trust, is really the conditions around us that we're setting. So I say that because at the team level, Nate, one of the most powerful drivers of team level trust was composure, which we define as this capacity to deal well with conflict and moments of change. And so I'm curious from your perspective, because we're actually doing a little side note in our report about conflict and composure and all those pieces of that. Why is that? Why did that emerge for you? That whole conflict trust connection. What are you thinking about in that space?
Yeah, yeah. Well, here's the premise and why I care about this at a theoretical level is most leaders we deal with, talk to, have a very negative or unhealthy relationship with conflict. And when I say a negative relationship, what it might mean is they'll describe their history with conflict, and it's just one negative thing after another. And for them, conflict is a bad thing. And they'll
Mm,
tell you all the examples of why. Or they have an unhealthy relationship with conflict, which means that when conflict comes, them and conflict are dysfunctionally connected.
mm,
And so they lose their composure, as you would
yeah.
maybe suggested. So here's our premise is if you believe that diversity and differences are a beautiful part of the grand design of the universe, which I do, and necessary construct for innovation, it's necessary for evolution. Without it, our world as we know it wouldn't exist. If you believe that, then you must also believe that the conflict which is inherent in differences must also be part of the grand design of the universe, because conflict is the only sure outcome of diversity. It's the only guaranteed outcome of diversity, is there's going to be conflict. But then the question is, what is that conflict? And for us, conflict is just the energy in the gap. There's a ton of
Mm,
energy in that gap. And the question isn't, is conflict good or bad? The question is, how are you going to manage that energy? And
mm,
now more than ever, energy management is probably the number one challenge of every leader, is energy management. We don't have enough. We're running out of it. So we're interested in this management of the energy of conflict, and that's where composure comes in. So we've developed an assessment of composure. We call it drama resilience because because the energy of conflict is a resource that you can steward, and there's almost unlimited amounts of it. If you steward that energy of conflict negatively, we call that drama.
mhm.
And if you steward it positively with composure, perhaps as you're calling it, that's called compassionate accountability. So
Yeah.
we have an index that measures drama resilience, which is a person's ability to steward that energy with composure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of our assessments in the Wild Toolkit is the leading under pressure inventory, which has so many similar and parallel kinds of impact
Mhm.
and emphasis. And
Mhm.
such a powerful thing what you just described. For our listeners, one thing I want to also mention that Nate said that I think is such an important thing to pay attention to. I'm backtracking a little bit, then I want to come back off road. Is that connection between that storyline between people and process, whatever you want to call it, between the visible parts of what we do, our task management, our operations, and the people is probably the oldest story in organizational psychological research. It's 100 years old. And so what Nate said is that simple focus of his organization on those two things is like anybody who is credible in this space has to be working those two things. Like it, and people so often they separate, right, the people issues from their organizational issues, and they are paradoxical, right? So they
Yeah.
sometimes compete with one another, but that emphasis on both of those things is so critical. And then when that drives to the individual level, there's individual level things that affect our ability to deal with these high conflict kinds of moments. And Nate, I was on a podcast, it was a week ago, and it was on innovation. It reminded me of when I first came on your podcast and we were talking about compassion. And I'm a guy who's like annoying about wanting to define terms. And so like when I would have PhD students who would come with their dissertation idea, I'd say, what are we talking about? Like if they hadn't defined the construct, that was the old story with Dr. McKenna that they were all annoyed by, was like, define the construct. So we did that with compassion. I wanted to come in hot with, this is what I understand compassion to be. Let's talk, Nate, about what you're doing in that space.
Mhm.
With innovation, it was interesting because you know the definition of innovation, it's the act of creating something new. The act of creating something new by definition is change, and change is the fundamental characteristic of conflict, right? It's because something's going to be different. Like molecules banging
Yep.
up against the side of a wall that creates pressure between us is when that change, or we're trying to create something new together. If we can't deal with conflict, like where are we?
Well, yeah. And in my book, Conflict Without Casualties, the main premise is the purpose of conflict is to create. That
Awesome.
is the big
Awesome.
mind shift. The purpose of conflict is to create. There's a lot of other ways we use it, but that's its actual purpose. So, to your point, innovation is to create something new, which means conflict is the
Yes.
opportunity to create something new. Then the big question becomes, so how do we do that?
Right.
And I just have to go back to, I think, again, as research psychologists, we care about operational definitions, because if we don't know what we're talking about in a way that can be quantified and observed,
That's
how
right.
do we measure it? How do we know if we're making progress? And how do we achieve what I call inter-rater reliability, which is the only way teams and organizations will ever be able to scale this, what we're dealing with.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
So about the importance of measurement
Yeah.
and assessment, like what is your take, and how would you encourage people to think about measurement and assessment?
Yes. Timing is good for me to talk about this. It's front of mind because I'm getting ready to teach a master class for our global network of trainers around the topic of why assessment. And so it's really about, what role does it play? Why does it matter? How does it fit for you? How do you use it? A couple things. Assessment is, it's the head side of the equation. There's the heart side, which is our gut feelings, our instincts, those testimonials about transformation. You shared a couple really good examples
Mhm.
in some of your videos about your platform, about how what leaders have said about their experience. Those aren't quantifiable,
Hmm.
but they hit the heart and they matter. And many of us make decisions based on that. But the head is the other side. Let's also subject it to some objective inquiry. If we can measure it objectively, we have two sources of data. They're both important,
Mhm.
quantitative, qualitative. And so I think there's a balance it gives us, but also the whole point of research is to make intelligent mistakes.
Mhm.
And so when we're measuring things, all of a sudden it's out of our own subjective hands. We can't maneuver things to turn out like we like it. And we start seeing things for what they are. And it causes us to ask better questions, to get curious, to wonder why there's this gap. And so I think that's another reason. Can I say one more reason why I love measurement?
Please, please.
I think a third reason for measurement is what I call why I talked about inter-rater reliability. This is a fancy research term for when a group of people are all looking at something, can they actually agree on what they're seeing? And you think about how important this is on maybe if we're going to launch a space shuttle, or maybe decide which artery to cut when we're doing heart surgery. If you have 2 or 3 surgeons that have their hands inside your chest, we need to know that when one doctor says cut the XYZ, there is 100% clarity that we all agree that we know which one that is, and that we're all going to say the same thing. But there's not that level of clarity around people stuff, conflict, communication, leadership, and there needs to be. And
Yeah.
so interreliability means we do the hard work to be able to measure and quantify the things that matter, so we can all agree on what we're seeing, and then we can all help each other grow.
I shared some of this information with you that half of the employees across our study are functioning with what we describe as the jungle of trust. That half of people, nearly 50%, are in organizations where they feel a lack of team trust, like a trust in their team members, but also a lack of sort of a organizational trust, a trust in their leaders and the systems that surround what it is, the conditions around what they're trying to do. And it was interesting because recently we gave feedback to an organization on their trust index scores, and it was an organization that was in the jungle. And I always think, going into those things, I've been doing this all my life of giving tough feedback to organizational leaders. And I thought, Nate, I still come back to like, how are they going to respond? And what was powerful just a couple of weeks ago is we asked at the end, so about their sense of the reliability of the data they were looking at.
Mhm.
And then we asked them sort of, so how do you feel about where this is landing in next steps? And they said, it was powerful. They said, this is an organization in the jungle. We're talking to a
Mhm.
CEO, global organization. And she said, I feel hope.
Mm.
And I'm so struck by that, Nate, because that's a very human emotion, right? Or feeling of
Yep.
hope that was connected to measurement.
Mhm.
And that the data provided a path,
Yep.
that was more powerful. That hope may not be a strategy, but to get there, you can do strategic things to get to hope.
Well, there's more than that, Rob. There's more than just the data. There's 2 other things you did that I want to highlight, because I've got a sneak peek at your data.
Yeah, yeah.
You use relatable terms. When you say jungle, I'm imagining people running around wondering who's going to attack them next, and it's everyone for themselves. So
Mm,
that concept of jungle is a very relatable term. You're not going to hear that in academic peer-reviewed articles. So you
yeah.
built a bridge with the words. I think that's really important too. So the data now has a personal context, but also I think you're doing something that we have a calling to do as researchers in this space, and it's to create frameworks and metrics that have 3 criteria, and I think your model does. Can I share them?
Uh, yeah.
I share them.
Yeah,
I
please.
think a good model and a good data has to have 3 criteria. You should be able to draw it on a bar napkin in 30 seconds for obvious reasons, because that's where you're going to need it. It has to be so simple and elegant. You could draw that 2 by 2 matrix, put a few dots on it, and people are going to be like, I get it.
Yeah.
In 2 minutes, it needs to tell my story. In 2 minutes, I should see myself and say, I'm in the jungle, or I'm over here.
Right.
And you'll know that's happening when somebody says to you, were you in my staff meeting last week?
Hmm.
Or do you have cameras in my boardroom?
Yeah.
Um, and in 5 minutes, it has to provide hope for a different story.
Hmm.
And your framework does all of those.
Hmm.
So it's metrics, but you've done some other amazing things around it, I think, that are really powerful.
You mentioned the connection between conflict and trust. Would you unpack that a little bit for us? What you how you're thinking about that?
Yeah. Well, we've believed for a long time, and we've shown it through our research and proven it through the work we do, that conflict can be a catalyst for growth, innovation, trust, creating new things. And we show people how to do that every day so that they can gain a new relationship with conflict as a resource and an asset rather than something to be scared of.
Hmm.
And but last year I started getting a higher and higher frequency of this question. Companies would come, or teams would come, or leaders, and they'd say, okay, here's our problem. We're working the pyramid of trust, or high performing teams. You build trust, and then you have conflict, and then you have accountability, and then you get to focus on results. And that's what we want. So, but we've done all the trust work, and we can't have conflict. Nobody will have any conflict. Everyone's avoiding conflict. They're running away from it like the plague. And so I'll usually say, okay, so gosh, how can we help? And they said, well, I guess we need to go back to square one because we don't have enough trust.
Hmm.
And I heard that a couple times, and I started saying, okay, what is their theory of change that they would say that? And here's the foundational assumption, is that trust is a prerequisite for conflict, and conflict takes money out of the trust bank. And so therefore, the only way to have conflict is you got to build up your big, huge bank of trust, because as soon as you do conflict, it's going to just start eating away at that. And what I started wondering is, I think we have it backwards. I think trust is not the enemy. Trust might be actually conflict isn't the enemy of trust. Conflict might be the foundation for trust. And and so what if we turn it upside down? Now, I don't know that 180 degrees is right, but I started asking myself this question now. What is the relationship? Because um, if the basic question is trust required to have conflict, or is healthy conflict required to build trust? I know that's an oversimplification, but that's what I want to study and really get to the bottom of.
What Nate just said is really important. I think this is a net new for some people. So the not bottom shelf version of that is that we oftentimes reproach trust as if it's an independent variable, a driver, as opposed to trust being an outcome. So one of the things I say, Nate, is that trust is what follows the equal sign. It's not what precedes it. And that's a really important shift for people, because if trust is the outcome, then that means that all these different pieces of the developmental puzzle are actually the prerequisites, as Nate just described. They're the drivers. And so the
Yep.
capacity to deal with conflict, and this is where it gets necessarily a little more complex than something as simple as conflict or not, is that if we increase our capacity to deal well with those moments of change, of innovation, of diversity, of thought, of people, if we get better at those moments of pressure, because the pressure is there, what Nate was describing is that's what actually increases trust,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to I got to have trust, and then I'll be able to deal with
Yeah.
conflict better.
Well,
That's a
we
profound
yes.
statement. That's a very simple statement, but very important, I think, for people to hear.
No, variable versus outcome. This is really important, and it's. I'm writing this down because I've got some questions for you later when we talk about this. But there needs to be an evolved formula for trust that includes this. And we have these situations where we're working on our conflict formula for people to do conflict with compassion and accountability. And at first they'll say, well, I can't do conflict because all these bad things will happen. And then they look at this formula and they see it starting to see how it can work. And they say, wait a second, if I felt more confident that I could do conflict and it wouldn't go off the rails, that's kind of hopeful. Like, hang on a second. So yeah, I'm
Yeah, it's funny.
passionate about this.
Yes, for sure. And we will keep talking. This is, um, I mean, even back to Bill Anderson, my conversation with him this morning was one of the fundamental things that when we've put these different assessments in people's hands, that I see in Bill's life is an increase in agency
Mhm.
and efficacy, right? It's
Yes.
fundamental psychology. And so, and it's interesting to think about the prerequisites to conflict is like, imagine how different a team member comes into a high pressure conflict moment when they have a healthy sense of themselves
Yep.
as opposed to not.
Yep.
And so that's the connection. If you see that between both Nate and our work on developing individual capacity that then has these incredible ramifications all the way through the pipeline of our organizations, all the way to trust.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, no, that whole idea of agency is so important because a good assessment to me, like when you created your assessment,
yeah,
you tried to create a way of quantifying your theory of change
right.
and install those glasses in other people. So
Yeah.
a good assessment, all it does is let someone put on a new pair of glasses to look at their situation. And that can be hugely empowering because all of a sudden they see the same thing in a new way. And I think a good assessment gives us the capability of doing that.
So true. I was struck by, I think I've mentioned this before, but our clinical friends who would say, they know that the intervention begins as soon as the person makes an appointment, like they've expressed intention. And the same
Oh,
thing's
yeah.
true with assessment is like it's not the feedback report that's necessarily the only powerful thing. It's the moment someone asks themselves a question. Because assessment is a question. So we're creating a frame of mind that's amazing. And Nate, you're just lighting me up with all of those things. So I'm so grateful for this conversation, Nate, and for the chance to talk about this. And we will continue this conversation. Sabbath, wow,
Wow, indeed. You have leaned in. I was watching your faces. I was no those smiles when you just speak in the same language. I was thinking, Nate, have you been in our conversations this week? Just speaking the same
yeah.
language. So thankful for this conversation. I was taking notes myself. And as we wrap up our time, as just the beginning of the conversation, I know there will be more to come. Nate, we want our listeners to know how they can connect with you. What is the best way for them to find you and the work that you're doing at Next Element?
Oh, thank you. We try to make it really easy. It's just Next Element. It's next-element.com, but if you look up Next Element, you'll come to our website and we try to make that a one-stop place where you can learn about me, learn about our work, connect with our podcast, read our articles, check out the books, whatever.
And one final question we like to ask all of our guests. Nate, are you in a season of accepting yourself or changing yourself?
Changing myself. I am going to be a grandpa in the next week, I think. Um, and so that is big.
That's
And
you.
this year so there's that. This year at Next Element, we're trying to go places we've never been before and take our message to places it's never been before and in a world that we've never seen before. So I'm changing.
Thank you. This has been a rich conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.